Howdy.
Good morning.
Hello. How are you today?
Well, I am on the tail end of a 2-week, what I thought was a flu, although it turns out it may be something else entirely, maybe an enterovirus in my system. And it's an interesting experience because I had a flu shot and then I got sick and I assumed that I had the flu and that the shot just hadn't caught it. But, I went to the emergency room ultimately and found out that it might be something other than the flu. And, that's an experience that probably millions of people have where they get a flu shot, they get sick with something, they assume it was the flu, and they come off thinking that, well, the flu shot didn't work, when in fact there are lots and lots of things out there that can give you a flu-like experience. And, that's something people have to be cautious of when they're kind of evaluating and saying, well, the flu shot doesn't work for me or the flu shot doesn't work. That, just because people get sick doesn't mean that the flu shot didn't protect them from the flu virus, which is a very distinct virus.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm glad you're here with us. For those of you who are not familiar with this gentleman over here, this is Brian Dean Abramson, and you wrote the book on vaccine law, right?
Oh, I have a copy of it. I always keep one on my desk in case I need to refer to it. Nice thick book.
Nice thick book.
Just sent the annual update to the publisher, which adds a lot of information about, there's always things when you put together a book like this that you have to make a decision whether to delve into it or to leave it out. And there are some things that when I wrote it initially, I didn't get into, and then I had the opportunity to put them in. A lot of additional coverage on vaccine requirements for employees in fields other than healthcare, such as airline crew, personnel, government contractors, and so forth. I put in a section on forced vaccination because that's a phrase that we've been hearing a lot. That, that there's some notion of forced vaccination out there, as though people are literally being grabbed off the street and jabbed with needles against their will. And it's interesting that if you go back to the smallpox epidemics of the late 19th century, that was a thing that happened sometimes, particularly in poor and minority communities. They would just literally have groups of vaccinators go out and grab people and hold them down and vaccinate them. And that is not a thing that happens anymore at all.
It's weird. Yeah. This collective conspiracy-like ideas that anti-vaxxers tend to have, particularly when it comes to the government's going to force us to do things, the government's going to force us to do that. I don't think that's what's going to happen, but I think the government is going to limit your access to certain things if you choose to not,
What the government is going to do is they're going to limit the access of people who are not vaccinated to areas in the public sphere where there may be people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons.
Right.
Or even, infants who can't be vaccinated because they haven't reached the minimum age for it. and therefore are in danger of exposure
Right.
through someone carrying the disease because they could have been vaccinated but weren't. And,
Right.
that's ultimately what a quarantine is. Although quarantines in the United States have tended to be much less restrictive than what we're seeing right now in China, which is something that I think we want to talk about today.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit about that today. I've been looking into what's been going on recently, and there have been like a lot of protests. New Jersey was a thing. So what I've done is I've gotten some videos together of different current things that are going on with vaccine law. Even an anti-vaxxer who has been indicted for assault for throwing things at it, and it's kind of gross. It was a menstrual cup of blood throwing that at people, and so it's just they're getting quite extreme with a lot of this.
Yeah, I think one of the most probably disturbing trends is, there's a lot of targeting of individual pediatricians and physicians. If people publicly make statements just affirming the science,
Yes.
they get online threats and attacks and kind of huge wave of people coming after them.
And I've got some videos on that as well. So what I thought we could do is take a look at a bit of a video of protesters in New Jersey, and that vote came out, and we can talk about that as well. So, sure.
Can I make one shout out first?
Sure.
Because today is my brother's birthday, my brother Gary. He is a graphic artist in LA. He is a very fervent transhumanist, and of course a supporter of the vaccine science, and also a huge Bernie Sanders supporter. And he would love for me to say that in a podcast. So,
okay,
happy birthday.
Awesome.
Happy birthday to my brother Gary.
Awesome. Well, let's take a look. There's a video. Let me pull up my folder so I can get the right one. It's in Riff videos. We've got, let's see. Protest roar in Trenton. Let's take a look at the protests in Trenton associated with the vaccine law. And we can talk a bit about what they were doing with that. So let's have a look at this video. Let's pull that up. Here we go.
Hey everyone, this is Sydney Shaw here with NJ.com. I'm outside the State House in Trenton today where there are at least a few hundred people protesting ahead of a potential resolution to the vaccine bill. For those of you who haven't been following that news, the Senate was set to vote on a bill that would repeal religious exemptions for vaccines required to attend public school. As it stands right now, parents can write a letter indicating they oppose the vaccine requirement for their child, citing religious reasons. Advocates for vaccines worry that's too lenient and that it allowed 14,000 or so children in New Jersey to avoid getting vaccines that are typically required to attend public school in New Jersey. Hundreds of protesters showed up to the State House that day in December, and lawmakers said it was among the largest, loudest, and longest protests in the State House history. At the end of the day, the Senate ended up calling off the vote because they were one vote shy to pass it. But they're considering the bill again today, which is why hundreds more protesters have turned out in Trenton.
Okay, let's talk about this. So
there's a lot to break down there.
Yes.
First of all, very clearly it is easy to inflame the passions of people, especially if you're able to instill in them some fear that they have a right that's being taken away or they're being put in danger. And there's a tremendous amount of rhetoric in the anti-vaccine community asserting that vaccines are dangerous. And there are hundreds of millions of people who have been vaccinated without any negative consequence. But if you can point to a few cases where an adverse reaction was attributed to a vaccine, even if it wasn't necessarily proven to be connected, that can frighten parents a great deal. Mm-hmm. And we're at a point in society where a lot of people are more frightened of what they perceive as consequences of vaccination than they are of the diseases that the vaccines protect against. And it's very interesting. Justice Scalia wrote an opinion of the Supreme Court where he said that vaccines were a victim of their own success, that they were so effective and so useful in deterring disease that people have forgotten about how terrible the diseases were that we once had that vaccines protected against. And there's also an issue where this is wrapped up in a notion of religious freedom, which is, to an extent, it's problematic and disingenuous because most of the religious leaders or heads of the religious bodies in the United States and throughout the world have basically endorsed vaccination, said that it's not against any of the major religions. But we've always had a trend in this country where when people don't want to do something, they say, well, this is against my religion. So if they don't want to pay taxes or have to wear a motorcycle helmet or a seatbelt, or they don't want their children to be sent to school, they want to, keep them on the farm working, then they say this is our religious belief and it's a violation for us to have to sway from that. And in fact, in all of those kinds of circumstances, first of all, courts have tended to kind of pierce through that and say, well, it's not really a sincerely held religious belief that you don't have to pay taxes. It's kind of you don't want to pay taxes and you're making an interpretation that's not in conformance with anything else. And even if it is sincerely held, there are certain civic duties that outweigh individual beliefs, and you have to see the consequences from them.
Well, also, I think a lot of thing where they say this is against my religious beliefs and that sort of thing, they're kind of negating the fact that what they're doing is impacting the whole of society, and that if you're going to participate in society in these ways and be a part of schools and be a part of public transportation and be a part of all of these things, you kind of have to get in and with everybody else on the fact that vaccines are a thing that we have to do. I mean, you can't just, if you're capable of undergoing vaccination and you don't, and you're a carrier for a disease or whatever, and then other people, but we've always talked about herd immunity and that sort of thing, but it is a bit of a cop-out. So it's almost like if you want to claim that, if you want to claim that this is against your personal belief system, against your religion, whatever, then if the rest of society is going to be impacted, you're going to have to stay at home. You're going to have to stay at home.
I always analogize it to laws, which every state has, requiring food preparation workers to wash their hands after they use the bathroom. You could envision someone saying, it's against my religion to do that. I don't believe in germ theory. I believe that a higher power will protect people from any sanitary issues I may have. So I shouldn't have to wash my hands before I go, work on making the salads.
Right. It's bonkers is the word. I think.
As a whole, I think would object to that.
Yes.
See some people making an argument for it, but I think there's an end to which we need to protect public health to the point where you say to that person, well, you can't work in the food service industry if you're going to insist that you can't maintain hygiene. And vaccination, fundamentally, it's a form of hygiene. It's a form of sanitation against specific, very detrimental diseases.
I get very frustrated, and I don't fight with anti-vaxxers. I don't fight with people on the internet. I try not to be rude, but there comes a point to where at some point in time, you just have to take your medicine. You, I mean, it's a lot of the fight back there, like body autonomy, autonomy. But then at the same time, I'll see like at pro-life marches where you have anti-vaxxers that are going, vaccines were made from aborted fetuses, and it's just like there's so much overlap between like pro-lifers and anti-vaxxers, and it's kind of strange. And I've just recently been seeing a lot of this, particularly with the Roe versus Wade stuff that's coming up, as far as a lot of concern on how, if that's going to be overturned. And I am giving a talk about that with another law professor and Dr. Leah Torres-Nobi next month. So that'll be interesting to see how that goes. But it's just, there's so much weird overlap there, and it's just maddening, because if it was just affecting you and no one else, that's fine. But it's like I've seen some people say secondhand smoke from cigarettes doesn't cause cancer, and you're like, oh my God. That's a thing that's affecting other people. So that's why California, you have to smoke outside. You go to London pubs, you can't smoke in the building. You have to smoke outside. And so, but because that's a thing, we're getting to a point now, vaccines need to be required if you're going to participate in society with the rest of us.
There are a lot of routes through which they are. In terms of requiring students to be vaccinated, get into to attend schools, and to be around other students where they can be in a position to infect them, and that is increasingly also being applied at the collegiate level. It's something I think employers have a fairly broad ability to do, just in a private sense, not through the power of the state, but an employer can say, we require all of our employees to be vaccinated. And, for any employer who has a large number of people working in close quarters, that's something that would be reasonable for them to look at. So there are different venues or different arcs kind of through which it is possible to impose that. I do think it's very interesting with the question of Roe v. Wade, with the sort of bodily autonomy question that raises. If you look at the history of vaccine cases or cases mentioning vaccination, it has very widely been raised as a situation where the state has the authority to impose itself on people to regulate the public health. The very first cases that the Supreme Court decided at the beginning of the 20th century came to that conclusion. And then, although there have only been a handful of cases directly addressing that, there have been a very large number of cases where the court has looked at issues of parental rights or issues of bodily autonomy, even issues of whether students attending school could be required to be searched for drugs or be allowed to be searched for drugs under some standard of suspicion. And vaccination has been pointed out as kind of a baseline of an example of the state having the right to impose on someone's individual medical decisions.
Right, right.
Abortion rights have kind of been presented as a limitation on the state's ability to impose on people's medical decisions, saying, the state can't get in between the doctor and the patient, for example, in this circumstance. And if you look at some recent developments in vaccine law in California, for example, within the past year, they passed a law that substantially tightened the regulation of doctors giving exemptions for vaccination.
Right.
Because there were some doctors who were just giving out exemptions left and right without a proper basis, without finding a contraindication. without necessarily even examining the patient, saying, okay, I'll take the parent's word for it that the child has some adverse reaction to vaccination and issue an exemption. And a lot of people in the anti-vaccination movement, of course, were very upset about this statute and kind of overstated the effect. The fact of the matter is doctors in California still can issue medical exemption from vaccination, but they have to examine the patient and they have to articulate a reason that demonstrates that there is an actual contraindication, that there is some condition that the patient has and can be demonstrated to have that militates against their vaccination. And this is,
Right.
This is perfectly reasonable. California actually, in doing this, was catching up with some other states that already have similar requirements. But this is a circumstance where we're saying that, well, the state can get between a particular doctor making a particular recommendation to a patient. And if we say we're going to overturn Roe v. Wade, and therefore we're going to we're going to say that okay, we're going to get between the doctor's judgment and the patient there, then that would seem to greatly strengthen the ability for the government to say we are going to get in between the doctor's judgment about an exemption to vaccination and the patient, and enforce it what the doctor says.
But see, it's kind of like it's with that situation, you're talking about something that affects the general population as opposed to something that affects the individual. And so much like the regulations, like you mentioned, on washing your hands if you're working food service or something like that, that affects the general population. And even if, there was some reason why a person couldn't wash their hands, they're like, well, then gloves. You have gloves. You have some kind of thing that prevents them from contaminating other people. I mean, and I don't know of anything that would say a person can't wash their hands, but I'm just throwing that out there if there's a case like that. And so when we get into like the Roe versus Wade thing, that's an individual. That's not the population. The vaccine thing is an effect on the general population, much like the cigarette smoking. And I find it really interesting. There was legislation a while ago about people not being able to sue fast food restaurants for them having adverse health effects. And it's like, well, you should just know that it's bad for you. So they've made it impossible for consumers to sue fast food restaurants for things associated with weight and health and, health issues associated with eating that food. So it's just like the government does impose a lot of things that makes it quite difficult for certain circles. But I don't see how overturning Roe versus Wade is going to make it more effective for the vaccine thing, because I feel like even though there's overlap there, I feel like
it would be counterintuitive. It would be very counterintuitive. Overturning Roe versus Wade would enhance the ability of the government to interfere with people's individual medical decisions, and that would be a very strong argument in favor of the government being able to literally mandate vaccination, to actually get to forced vaccination or things like that.
Okay, so I have another video I think I'd like us to kind of check out. And by the way, the New Jersey thing, they lost. The New Jersey law actually did not go into effect. Maybe
there's been a number of states, New York, Washington, Maine, that have within the past year removed their religious exemptions. I think there were fairly large protests and counter movements in each of those, but ultimately those states nevertheless passed the legislation removing or restricting religious and philosophical exemptions for vaccination. So it's a trend, and when there's a trend like that, there will always be kind of a step backward, more steps forward.
Right.
And it's also we're a little bit removed from the measles outbreak that we had last year. Of course, where we have relaxation of vaccination requirements, inevitably, ultimately, there is some kind of outbreak, and that historically has always been the thing that turns the screw. If you go back to the earliest, the mandates for smallpox and mandates for every other kind of vaccination for which mandates now exist, there's always been a kind of a medical disaster that occurred with lots of children dying and lots of people becoming gravely ill, and that has kind of turned the needle back in the direction of additional regulation, of additional requirements or efforts to push people towards vaccination. And we had that last year with measles. We will have it again with something else, because there are always populations where the vaccination rate drops off, and then it only takes one person who's a carrier of a disease to come in, and all these vulnerable people become potential casualties of that.
Oh, we got a super chat in. Thank you for the super chats. Learning with Suge. I have to get going, but this is such an important topic. I'll catch the rest tonight. Thanks for having Mr. Abramson on to discuss, Mel. Well, thank you, Suge. Thanks for stopping by. So I do want to kind of address, I've got a video, it's called The Vaccination Debate. The anti-vaccine type of movement is increasing quite a bit. So let's have a look at this video with some numbers that they have associated with anti-vaxxers and distrust in vaccines. Let's have a look.
The vaccination debate rages on in this country. Lawmakers in New Jersey refused to pass a bill that would have eliminated religious exemptions for school-required vaccinations. A new poll shows support for vaccinations has dropped 10% in the U.S. over the past 2 decades. CBS's Meg Oliver has more on what's driving the decline.
New Jersey is the latest state fighting over vaccination requirements for children to attend public school. On Monday, thousands protested a bill that would eliminate religious exemptions. Lisa DeRogatis has never vaccinated her 3 children.
I feel like this is a fascist overreach of the government and taking away religious and medical freedoms.
I got to stop it right there. A fascist... a fascist overreach of the government. And, so we're seeing a 10% decline in vaccine support, and we've got a fascist overreach of the government. Oh my God, that's ridiculous.
The anti-vaccine movement has been very effective in kind of packaging its message. And there are a lot of aspects of vaccination that they're technical. They're not something that the average person is educated about. So it's very easy to kind of put disinformation or mischaracterize information and put that out there in ways that are very convincing. And that's one thing where, I give the anti-vaccine movement its due, that, they've been very kind of effective in packaging a message. It's very similar kind of to the effectiveness of the tobacco industry in the 1960s, when they were packaging their message that cigarettes don't cause cancer. And they got some reputable scientists who they hired as kind of spokespeople and put together all sorts of statistics and deflected to all sorts of other causes that could be blamed. It's also very similar to what the gasoline industry did at the time when there were efforts to remove lead from gasoline. And I said, look, the leaded gasoline is causing all these health problems. And, they had scientists who were reputable and affiliated with reputable institutions came out and said that lead in gasoline isn't a problem, and there are other causes and so forth. And they're doing that now, but they're doing it with a lot more slick graphics and catchy memes and emotionally rendering images, which they may not be accurate, but they're certainly very powerful.
Exactly. I find if you get with a lot of this, the a well put together video that takes snippets. I mean, we had that, like with the glyphosate thing that was going on. They're like, this can cause cancer, and look at all of these other court cases and stuff. And I've had to have somebody come on in the past to talk about how a verdict for something like that isn't the same as scientific fact.
Right, because to obtain a verdict, you have to convince a jury of sort of average people from the citizenry that there's a preponderance of evidence, and it's if you even in criminal cases and civil cases that have nothing to do with any kind of scientific issue, you often see that who wins or loses the case comes down to who has the more charming lawyer,
the more compelling argument. So,
or who has the expert witness who kind of looks more like the person out of central casting from a Hollywood studio for an expert in the topic.
Who's George Clooney looking? Are they compelling enough, like Matt Damon and like Good Will Hunting, or are they funny enough like Robin Williams? So it's weird when you see all of this. I've got I want to show you and so I want to show you guys something. There was an arraignment of an anti-vax. I don't even know if it's kind of, I don't know. I thought it'd be interesting. So protesting is a thing that anti-vaxxers do. And, it's their right. People can protest all they want and say things like that. So let's have a look at this arraignment of this anti-vaxxer. They're getting very PETA-like, where they're kind of getting super freaking aggressive. I dare say I expect some kind of collective marketing scheme from anti-vaxxers. We've already got the Vaxxed movie. We've already got all of these other things that they're using. They're walking the lines of crazy media stunts like PETA. And so let's have a look at this arraignment of this anti-vax that just happened, I think, the past few weeks.
In charge in count 1 on or about September 13, 2019 in Sacramento County, the felony violation of Penal Code Section 217.1, Parent A, in that it's alleged that you committed assault upon the persons of Benjamin Allen, Kathleen Galgiani, Steve Glazer, Lena Gonzalez, Melissa Hurtado, Hannah Beth Jackson, Holly Mitchell, Richard Pan, Susan Rubio, and Nancy Skinner, who were California state senators. Count 2 charges on that same date a separate count of felony Penal Code Section 594, Parent A, vandalism in the state of California.
Very well. All right, and what will be our next court date?
Your Honor, we're requesting February 24th in the morning, please.
All right, February 24th at 8:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, pull us back. So the assault that she was charged with, I'm trying to pull up the article here, is that she was throwing a menstrual cup with blood at these different individuals. And it's like, this is PETA level madness, or PETA level, or PETA. PETA has me blocked on Twitter. They don't like me, but that's fine. I don't like them either, so it's okay. But they're reaching a level to where it's insane tactics. And part of my fear is that the bandwagon effect. This is kind of what we see with anti-vaxxers. The more people who believe a particular thing, is that it's more likely to be perceived as fact. So, so I don't know.
Well, first of all, that's an awful lot of assault. That
they're all at senators, California senators. So yeah.
And it is, I'm not going to speak to how that particular case may turn out, because every case has its own defenses and evidence. But where people do get to the point of breaching the law, there tend to be consequences, and those consequences tend to mollify later attempts to do the same thing. Now, of course, there are people who, once they have it in their mind that there's some great wrong, especially if they have kind of a religious conviction that there's some great wrong that's going on, can be motivated to do terrible things. It brings to mind, for example, Eric Robert Rudolph, who bombed an abortion clinic, and
yes,
I think he did some other bombs. And
we've seen that with the pro-lifers, but it's kind of it's getting kind of scary with the anti-vaxxers. If they're willing to throw blood at people,
it's not inconceivable that you could have someone who gets inculcated with this message. And I think the typical anti-vaccine activist would be horrified at the notion that a pediatrician's office could be bombed because someone has bought into this rhetoric so intensely that they think that is, that they're saving lives of children or something like that through such an action. But really, it's not at all inconceivable. And people have to think about the responsibility of, the degree of the rhetoric. I mean, there are a lot of people who, if you ask them, they'll say, well, I'm not anti-vaccine. I just want people to be informed about things or what have you, but then they have misinformation.
Right.
And, there are even people who say, I believe that vaccines work generally, but I don't want to give them to my children. I don't believe in them for me, or something like that. But when those people disseminate kind of the extremes of the message, they are feeding the ultimate end of someone breaking the law or engaging in violence because they've been led to believe that there is some terrible wrong, some endangerment of lives that can only be remedied by taking out the people who are giving the shots.
Right. And we mentioned prior to going on live, and I have a video about this. There was a pediatrician, well, I think she's a pediatrician, medical doctor, who made a TikTok video in response to some of those viral videos of anti-vaxxers going around. And she's been threatened, had her life threatened. Let's take a look at that video. It's pro-vaccination social media. So people who are pro-vax are now getting death threats. It's kind of scary. Let's have a look at this.
An amazing pediatrician is under fire after a video she posted to social media supporting vaccines. It's led to threats, and now police are involved. 9 Under Side's Kristen Swilley joins us with how all of this unfolded and what's next for that doctor. Kristen?
Well, the Deerfield Township Police confirmed someone made a threatening call to Dr. Nicole Baldwin's practice after she posted a pro-vaccination video to the social media site TikTok that got a mixed response nationwide.
Vaccines are safe. vaccines are effective. We want all of our families to be protected.
After watching the online conversation for years, Dr. Nicole Baldwin wanted to move the needle.
For so long, the voices of the anti-vaccine community have been so loud.
So she thought she'd give TikTok a shot with this pro-vaccine video.
I know some other physicians that have been on TikTok spreading, different messages about health, so I thought, okay, I'll try it out and see.
Her post ends with the message, "Vaccines don't cause autism." She shared it on Twitter the next day, and that's when it really took off.
It got to a point of a more coordinated, large-scale attack on me, to the point where I wasn't able to maintain any sort of conversation with anybody.
The source of the contention? A large online community of people who think vaccines are harmful, many of whom believe in the scientifically debunked theory they cause autism. The Centers for Disease
bring us
Control
back. Let's have a look at this. Let's talk a bit about this. So anti-vaxxers have relied heavily on media to perpetuate their particular perspective. And now we have the same amount of doctors and pro-vaccine parents, whether it's parents, medical professionals, science communicators, who are putting, information out there to try to counter all this, to show, look, they're safe, it's fine. And now they're getting death threats, getting phone calls to their offices.
Well, I should first point out that making death threats is illegal.
Yes, very.
People tend to imagine in a sort of age of online anonymity that, I can call someone and make a death threat and I won't be traced back to me, or I can make a death threat on the internet and it won't be traced back to me. And it's kind of a separate issue, but there's a tremendous amount of naivete about what can in fact be traced back to you from your phone or over the internet. So people who are doing things like that are kind of seriously miscalculating the consequences to themselves. And, really broadly, people who engage in things like doxing or making any kind of public threat really underestimate the degree to which that can come around and get back to them, be traced back to them, because it can.
It can, and I don't think people realize, just on Twitter, all of your tweets are recorded in the Library of Congress, by the way. That is a thing.
If you're making death threats, if you're threatening physical harm to people because you disagree with their views, then that doesn't particularly speak well to the strength of your argument. It's if you disagree, present your facts. And in the case of, for example, people who are trying to connect vaccines to autism, the facts are not helpful to them. There have been a lot of studies conducted now, and I think the kind of routine response is, if a study is conducted, even on a very large scale with hundreds of thousands of people being examined over years, and it concludes that there's no correlation between vaccination and autism, then they'll say that there's something wrong with the study, that the people conducting the study were somehow corrupt or paid off or whatever. But there's never been a valid study that can be pointed to that and that can be replicated, that shows a connection between, a correlation between vaccination and autism, or between vaccination and many other conditions that have been associated with vaccination. And in the United States, we have vaccine masters under the United States Court of Federal Claims that hear all the vaccine injury cases that are brought in this country, just about. And they had an omnibus proceeding in 2005 where they literally said to people who were claiming autism as a vaccine injury, give us your best cases, present your best evidence, put on your experts, show your data, and the government will put on its best experts and show its data. And they had a very extensive process. A lot of people testified, and they concluded that there was not even a preponderance of evidence to show that correlation. And some people respond to that and say, well, this court is in some way pro-vaccine or pro-vaccine pro-vaccine industry.
It's a big pharma, hey.
But the fact of the matter is the vaccine court very frequently gives people awards for an adverse response, for which there is a correlation with vaccination. Now, it's a very tiny proportion of all vaccinations. There are perhaps as many as 1 billion individual vaccinations given in the world every year, because children all over the world get them. Adults get flu shots in many different countries. So, I've seen that number that it's probably about 1 billion actual vaccinations. And, worldwide, there are a few thousand vaccine injuries reported or alleged. And again, we have correlation and causation problems. If someone receives a vaccination, I've seen it said where someone receives a vaccination and then on the way home from that, they're in a fender bender. And someone wants to say, well, there's some reason that it caused that. The vaccination
it caused my car wreck. Oh gosh.
Yeah. The conclusion that I wanted to bring that to is the vaccine court is not at all shy about saying, we find a connection between this injury and this vaccination. And they've done that with intussusception cases with rotavirus, which had a vaccine that had that effect. That vaccine was withdrawn from the market. So, the court is not covering up for anyone. It's not protecting the industry. It doesn't do that in cases where there is demonstrable correlation. But with autism, there simply is
There's
not,
nothing there.
based on all the science that's available.
So I want to take a minute. I have a new sponsor for the channel.
Is it a pharmaceutical company? Is it the pharmaceutical industry? Is your new sponsor?
It's a fake commercial. It's meant for comedy. So let's have a look at our latest sponsor. I think Karen has been on the show a couple of times, so she's come back to talk about her latest thing. So let's have a look and see what Karen has to say.
Hello, I am the digital representation of Scientist Mel. I want to take a moment to thank all of my patrons on patreon.com/ScientistMel, as well as all of you who are giving through super chats and my help with GoFundMe for my computer. Thank you so much, as well as PayPal and any Streamlabs donations. I really appreciate your help. So guess what, guys? We have a special word from our newest sponsor. So let's check it out. Yay! Hey there, my name is Karen, and I would like to speak with you for a moment about vaccines. Did you know that there are chemicals in DNA in vaccines? Actual chemicals and DNA! Can you believe that? It's bad enough that we have all these chemicals and DNA in our food, and doctors now inject this into our bodies. So what are we gonna do? Well, I am starting a GoFundMe to stop vaccines and start a new science, taking tiny pieces of a virus and putting that into our bodies. Kind of like those chickenpox parties where we all got all natural immunity. That's pretty smart, huh? So just like that, no more chemicals in that icky DNA. Just the natural infections Mother Nature intended for us. So join me on my GoFundMe to help kickstart this brand new science using all natural virus for a healthy, safe, completely new idea for your immunity.
Oh, gosh.
I'm actually reminded of a TV commercial that I saw for one of the gasoline brands that said that our gasoline works at the molecular level, and as if there is any kind of gasoline that does not work at the molecular level.
I know. I saw there was a Facebook post that was going viral of an anti-vaxxer saying, "You know what would be great? Why don't we just take bits of the virus and inject that into us, and then that will help with the immunity?" It was like, oh my God, what do you think vaccines are? It's like they have anti-vax their way all the way back around.
there are concerns that are raised. I mean, a vaccine has different components, and it has to have different components because there are different issues that have to be solved. So vaccines have to have some kind of a preservative to keep them from literally to keep them from getting infected with something else,
bacteria and other things.
And they have to be cultured generally in an animal medium, and it's usually eggs. And a lot of vaccines contain adjuvants. Which are things that mildly irritate you because we want to kind of provoke your body into developing an immune response.
Right.
And the adjuvant is there's a lot of there's aluminum in some vaccines, and they make it sound like it's this terrible harmful thing when the amount of aluminum in the adjuvants in the vaccines is much, much lower than the amount of the exact same chemicals that we're getting in our food and even in our air every day.
Mean, the thing is, people associate the word chemical meaning toxic, and that's not what it is. You have toxic and you have non-toxic, and so I had seen at one point in time going around a petition to where they needed to put labels on food. This contains DNA, and it's like literally everything you eat contains DNA. But it's frustrating because I see a lot of these individuals, they just don't understand basic science in any capacity, and they're seemingly unwilling to learn.
And that's very exploitable.
Yes.
One of the things I find most problematic is when there are people who do understand the basic science and repeat the misinformation because they should know better.
Yeah, they should.
And they have, their own motivations for saying things that they know better than to think those things are true. There's also a great capacity of people to, if you explain things to them and demonstrate beyond any shadow of a doubt that, this isn't really how things work, they can get that and then a day later go back to believing that things are the way that they aren't.
True. I have some things I kind of want to take a look at. I'm part of an anti-vaxxer Facebook group. You'd be like, why would you join that? It's like, so I can see what they're actively discussing and what it is that they're doing. I don't post there. I don't fight with people there. It's morbid curiosity and just the sheer fascination of what goes on in their minds. This particular group has about 30,000 people in it. So I have a segment that's called Stupid Things on the Internet. So let's have a look. How about the stupid things on the internet? Let's give a go with that and see how that goes. Let's pull up. There's a picture. It's stupid vaccine. I labeled it stupid vaccine. Let's pull this picture up. If you can't read that, I'll read it to you. This is talking about I believe, the coronavirus, that particular conspiracy that's going around. And this person posted in this group, it says, can anyone direct me to anywhere that would indicated, and it's, I guess they meant indicate, would indicated how many viruses are patented? Also, how many viruses and vaccines are patented by Bill Gates? Literally impossible to Google anything about this. Not to mention, I had a difficult time finding this group. Side note, is anyone curious about Bill Gates having warned us in 2017 about a deadly disease that will kill many? Now, all of a sudden, here is the coronavirus, which, correct me if I'm wrong, has been recently patented with a brand new vaccine in the making. And so there is some reasonable people here that have actually got a bit of pushback. It says, one of the bottom right corners says, the coronavirus is not new and researching it does not indicate that it is some apocalyptic plague. The media, as usual, is like Chicken Little. The sky is falling. This virus can be killed by normal household cleaners. Yes, some folks may die from it, but no more than any other virus if their immune system have been weakened by traditional medical practices or other major health issues. A healthy person can be treated with antibiotics and recover. You can't. Okay, we'll get to this in a minute. Again, I feel it's overhyped, just like the Ebola outbreak years back. Where did that so-called epidemic go? Oh my goodness, let's talk a little bit about this. Oh my goodness.
Well, yes. First of all, coronavirus has been around for at least 10,000 years that we know of. And like all living things, it evolves over time. Viruses going through generations fairly quickly tend to evolve very quickly. So we have a new strain of the coronavirus, but it's an old virus, and it's one that there have been efforts to find a vaccine for, to develop a vaccine for many years. And of course, when you have an outbreak like this, and the same thing happened in response to the Ebola outbreak, you have efforts that get ramped up very quickly to, can we isolate the virus? Can we determine what would make an effective vaccine for it? So there are always going to be efforts underway to find vaccines for things that kill people or that kill animals, because the animal raising industries care about that. I haven't heard of any particular. I mean, there's a principle of law that you can't patent a living thing that you discover in nature in the first place. So there's no patent on the coronavirus. Now I will say there are.
Well, I have heard that you can, and I've looked at it, but you can patent the genetic sequence of the virus if you sort that out, but you can't patent the virus itself, which is kind of funny because they're making this insinuation that this was a generated virus that was made up just for the sole purpose of selling vaccines for it.
Well, you can't just isolate a genetic sequence and patent that. You can isolate a genetic sequence, and then you can patent the method by which you isolated it, or the method by which it can be isolated in the future. And you can patent a use for it. You can say, okay, I've isolated this genetic sequence, and I found a way it can be used in a vaccine or something like that. And there are many, many patents for genetic sequences under that rubric. But you can't just say, okay, I've isolated the sequence, and I've used an old off-the-shelf method of isolating it, and I don't have any particular use for it, but I want to patent it. You can't do that.
Fair enough.
And you can, in theory, you can genetically engineer a virus and patent that. And in fact, there are viruses that are not harmful to people that have been genetically engineered exactly because they're not harmful, but they use the mechanisms that viruses typically use in order
for immunotherapy.
Right, for immunotherapy.
Yeah, immunotherapy is one of them.
Something good to the body. And I find it very interesting that historically, when you have a major threat, if coronavirus were to spread to the United States and hundreds or thousands of people were to die from it, which wouldn't be terribly surprising because we have tens of thousands of people who die from the flu every year. But if coronavirus, it would be widely reported, it would be novel, and you'd have lots and lots of people scrambling for, please develop a vaccine for this, vaccinate me for this, vaccinate my children. And where an epidemic gets bad enough, all the people who purport to be against vaccination, or a great many of them, would suddenly find it expedient to be vaccinated for whatever this thing was that was really causing a danger to society. That's something that happened with smallpox, where you had people who were against smallpox vaccination when, it wasn't around their area, but who, when people started dropping dead around them from smallpox, said, okay, I'll get vaccinated.
All of a sudden, rather not die today. Might try this vaccine, give it a go. Let's pull up another stupid thing I found on the internet. This is part of Stupid Vax one from the same group. Let's have a look at what this says. Virginia man loses fingers, legs in battle with the flu. Pray for our family. So this was posted there. First person says, the flu led to pneumonia, then pneumonia led to massive infection. Someone's like, poor guy. And then this person says, sadly, this is what happens when we tamper with our immune system. A simple illness turns into an all-out disaster. I'm not being callous. I just want people to understand that the flu doesn't do this if your immune system is healthy and untampered with. Okay, pull us back on that.
Well,
that's weird.
Again, hundreds of millions of people all over the world get a flu vaccine every year. And most of them are protected from the flu by it. Either they're protected entirely and they don't get the flu because they've been vaccinated. So when they're exposed to the flu virus, their body already has the immunity that it would have developed through going through the flu. Or if the vaccine isn't quite attuned to the strain of the flu that's going around, it'll still protect them to a degree, and they'll have a less severe case from which they'll recover more quickly. And that is the case in the vast majority of instances. I don't know anyone in the industry of developing or marketing flu vaccines who does not get an annual flu vaccine themselves. It's kind of this common topic of conversation. And it's one of the most effective pieces of rhetoric that can be put out there to counter all the anti-vaccine talk, is to say, look, here's the picture of me getting the shot. You think it's dangerous. I'm willing to put my health on the line to the extent of saying I'm getting a flu shot. Last year I got my DTaP booster because it was time. I want to get a shingles shot because I had chicken pox as a child before, which infected me when I was at too young of an age to have been vaccinated for it. But I can't get the shingles shot yet because, I'm not old enough for it to be covered by my insurance. But I'm getting very close to being old enough. So, but I would, I actually suggested to my wife, it would be interesting to make a podcast or something where I just get every vaccination that's available, even the ones that people don't normally get, like adenovirus and anthrax and cholera and so forth. And she vetoed that, but I would have no problem saying that it's safe to do that, and would certainly subject myself to that for science.
Right.
There's some common sense. You would space them out every couple days or once a week or so, but there only are about 30 diseases for which a vaccine has been developed. And I see all kinds of rhetoric about how children will be required to get hundreds of vaccinations, and it's just not true. It's just not factually true that there are even that many things that can be vaccinated against. And then of the 30 or so that exist, only about half of them are required anywhere. And you have measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, varicella, which is chickenpox, pneumococcal pneumonia, meningococcal meningitis. These are all terrible things you don't want to get. So it kind of makes sense. You have influenza on top of that. But, there are also plenty of vaccines that are not required. Like the adenovirus vaccine, there's a vaccine that exists, but it's not even licensed for use in the United States. The only way you get it is if you join the military. And if you join the military, you will automatically get it.
They have one for anthrax. Yeah.
They have an anthrax vaccine. Whenever there is a quote unquote anthrax scare, everyone in the military gets vaccinated for anthrax. And every few years, there is an anthrax scare. Someone gets white powder in an envelope somewhere.
Yes.
So, that's something that's out there. And then there's things like yellow fever. It's not required anywhere in the United States. If you travel to other countries, you may be required to receive it.
Right.
Malaria, they've just
all of those
developed a vaccine that's more effective. And then they're the purely the rabies vaccine you only get if you're bitten by a rabid animal,
right?
Which is a rare thing, but it does happen. I don't know. I can't imagine how an anti-vaccine person would respond to their child being bitten by a rabid animal, for which the only treatment is a vaccine. And without that treatment, the chance of death is extraordinarily high. But
exactly. It's weird. You had mentioned, I want to pull up one more image. It's a stupid Vax 4. It's from this same group. And this says, does anyone know if there is a motion to repeal the 1986 Act? Can the 1986 Act be repealed at all? Because from my understanding, pharma owns the government and media. There is a petition to sign for repealing the 1986 Act. It would change the whole course of everything since vaccine manufacturers, they spelled that wrong, it's okay, would back off making vaccines if they were held liable again. And then somebody responds and says, the Congress would have to do it. The House has to introduce the bill, approve through vote, then move it to the Senate, approve through vote. The sitting president sign it. Lots of people would need to get it done, and considering the amount these people receive from pharma, nearly impossible. That's the real quid pro quo going on lobbying. Okay, let's talk about that a bit. Maybe a lot of people don't know what the 1986 Act is. Maybe you can weigh in a little bit on that. What is the 1986 Act?
Well, the 1986 Act they're talking about is the National Vaccine Injury Program. It's the National Vaccine Act that set up the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, which is the court that I mentioned before that is under the Court of Federal Claims that has special masters where if you assert that you have been injured by a vaccination, then rather than suing the manufacturer, you go to this court. You actually have a lower burden of proof, so it's easier to get compensated, even if you can't prove the injury. Excuse me.
It's okay.
And it has been upheld in the Supreme Court under challenges. That was in part the decision that Justice Scalia wrote in Bruisewitz v. Wyeth, I think is the name of the case. So it does insulate the vaccine manufacturers from liability. But really, it's part and parcel of, as you may know, there's long been a sort of anti-plaintiff notion that we need to limit how much plaintiff lawyers can get in litigation. That civil litigation had gone off the bounds. So in the 1970s, there were some cases where vaccine manufacturers were sued primarily for secondary infections from the live oral polio vaccine. So the oral polio vaccine, which is not used in the United States anymore, is one through which someone who had not previously been vaccinated for polio and who was an adult could get a secondary infection when the vaccine was administered to a child. There was no danger to the children. It was very safe for them. But sometimes adults who came in contact with a child could get a secondary infection. So there were some lawsuits. And there were some very high penalties that were assessed by juries. And I don't know where they get the notion that this would have to arise in the House and then go to the Senate. That's not exactly, that only applies to tax legislation. There is one area of legislation, which is taxes, where that is the case. But for most legislation, it can arise either in the House or the Senate. But the fact of the matter is, it's a very well thought out and well put together piece of legislation that could be applicable to a lot of other fields. We don't want vaccine manufacturers to be dissuaded from making vaccines because they may be subject to frivolous litigation even, which can be very costly. So the law as it's established says that if you claim a vaccine injury, first you have to go to the special masters and make your case there. And the fact of the matter is, if you aren't going to prevail before the special masters with their lower standard of evidence, then it's unlikely that you're going to prevail anywhere. But that actually does increase the chances and improve the chances of people claiming a vaccine injury to get appropriate compensation for that injury. In Bruceovitz v. Wyeth, there's a provision in the law that says that you can reject the determination of the special masters and then go to court and sue the vaccine manufacturer. However, there are still some additional restrictions on that, including the fact that you have to demonstrate, really that that whatever went wrong didn't conform with what the labeling on the vaccine says. So the vaccine labeling contains many legally required warnings about, this is how it has to be used, and these are potential effects, and this is how to kind of guard against those. So if all their labeling is correct, then they're still generally not liable as long as the vaccine was manufactured in accordance with the best practices for manufacturing vaccines. Now, there's actually a situation that occurred about 2 years ago in China, where it was discovered that vaccine manufacturers in that country were cutting corners. They were diluting their vaccines. They were putting in unnecessary chemicals kind of as extenders, and there were injuries that were caused by that. And China reformed its laws because of that to say, we're going to really crack down on manufacturers and make sure that they are following the best manufacturing processes. So in this country, if the manufacturers follow the processes that lead to vaccines having no adverse effect on hundreds of millions of people who receive them, then they can't be sued under the law. And that was the interpretation that the Supreme Court made in Bruceovitz v. Wyeth. That the law exempts manufacturers from liability unless you're actually saying that there was some malicious act, we're going to cut corners and not manufacture this vaccine properly. There's still liability for the physician who administered the vaccine, perhaps the hospital where it was administered or the clinic where it was administered. Although that again presumes that you've gone to the vaccine court and are not satisfied with their adjudication. And it's not evidence by itself to say that I went to the vaccine court and they gave me, either they didn't find liability or they found a very low monetary compensation for that liability. That's not proof that you can bring to a court and say, well, this is why I should or should not be compensated for this. But it's very unlikely that you're going to go through that process with a strong enough case that you could go and sue the administrator of the vaccine. And I don't think there's any thought whatsoever in Congress, even among the handful of members of Congress who are kind of anti-vaccine. We know who they are. There's never been a proposal to repeal that law that I know of, and it was enacted in the first place with strong bipartisan support. It was, I think it was passed with a Democratic Congress, and I'm not sure if the Senate was Democratic or Republican, but it had the support of Ronald Reagan, who signed it into law. And that court has been continued, and the law has had the continued support of every Congress since then, Republican or Democrat, every president since then, Republican or Democrat. When Donald Trump was a candidate, he said some things that the anti-vaccine community found to be kind of heartwarming to them, that gave the sense that he had some anti-vaccine predisposition. But when we had the measles epidemic, he's kind of totally turned around on that. His Surgeon General has been a very strong advocate of vaccination and of removing certain exemptions to vaccination, and has gone to the states and talked to the legislators about doing that. And actually, in the first quarter of last year, President Trump donated his salary to the Office of the Surgeon General while it was carrying out those activities. So it's very clear that at the political level, there's very strong support for vaccination. I went to a hearing in Congress, in fact, on vaccination when they were having hearings during the measles epidemic. And
I remember about that.
all of the members of Congress on the panel, Republican and Democrat, were very supportive of the witnesses who were testifying, who were from the CDC and the FDA, and who were very pro-vaccination in their testimony. And all the members of the panel made statements. There were some that particularly struck me. There was one Republican member of the panel who remembered in his childhood how measles had come through his town. He had it. He had a very bad case, but he survived. He had a sibling who died. And that led him to be very pro-vaccination because he was of a generation that had that experience. So, I think, first of all, repealing the act would not necessarily have any effect on vaccination mandates. It wouldn't necessarily affect the manufacture of vaccines. But either way, there is absolutely no kind of political movement
backing for
motivation
any of that.
It's just it's not realistic what happened.
It's not realistic at all, and I don't think it's anything that is going to happen, something that's been long-standing like that. It's not a buzzword. It's just
it's
none
very
of that
interesting that one of the arguments that I've seen anti-vaccine people make is that X amount of money has been awarded to people who have made vaccine injury claims. And the amount is, I think, $4 billion over a period of about 36 years.
Yeah.
And we have a substantial number of very generous awards that have been given out. So, it sounds like a tremendous amount of money, but it's really spread out over that length of time.
Yeah.
It's certainly far less than has been awarded for many other kinds of pharmaceutical injuries that have been alleged.
Right. Well, I think the lesson is to kind of take from here is that a lot of legislation is moving towards making vaccines more mandatory, particularly limiting medical exemptions.
Yes, and you will always have some states where there's a movement in the opposite direction for a little bit. States where they say, okay, we're going to expand exemptions, or where some group of legislators will try to do that.
Right.
But the overall trend is, as it has been, to limit exemptions, to reduce exemptions, or to put conditions on them so that we can really test to see whether someone has a sincere and legitimate religious objection that is actually founded in some doctrine of the religion they can point to, or someone has a legitimate medical condition that makes it difficult for them to receive a vaccination.
Right. I think we're probably going to wrap it up here because we're coming up on an hour and a half. And I know you've got a sore throat and all. If anybody has any questions, we can scroll back through for a second and kind of pick up a few. But what it's looking like is probably going to happen is more states are going to kind of limit the religious exemption and that sort of thing. It's unlikely to have that act overturned. Coronavirus, that's not a conspiracy to make a vaccine. None of that is the case. None of that's happening. I think it's just interesting. And, it's pretty sad that doctors are now being threatened on the internet just for speaking up about, vaccine safety. I think Tony Designs had a question about having multiple vaccines at once. That's not a good idea. I haven't read anything counter to where you can't have multiple vaccines at the same time unless you have some kind of medical type of issue associated with it.
I will say two things about that. First, that we're exposed in our daily lives to all different kinds of irritants and viruses and bacteria and other microorganisms all the time. So being exposed through vaccination to 3 or 6 or some number of specific viruses or virus components in the vaccine is not really that big a load compared to what the body normally takes. And secondly, there's a separate regime for testing combination vaccines. So every vaccine that is developed goes through multiple phases of safety testing on animals, testing on voluntary human subjects, and then tracking through a number of different systems to see if there are any large-scale kind of correlations, even if it's a 1 in 10,000 instance of something happening. So, they have to go through that on an individual basis in order to have a combination vaccine like measles, mumps, rubella. They're all combined into one. That whole route of testing has to be done again for the combination vaccine. So it has to be tested as a combination on animals, on humans, on groups of volunteers, different sizes.
And the regulations associated with getting the vaccine out. They are very strict, and a lot of people don't quite understand that. And then they make they make all of the arguments. Well, the FDA is bought by big pharma, and you're just, after a while, it's just, there's always going to be an excuse. There's always going to be an excuse that they're going to come up with. So
there's a point where it shifts from scientific concerns to just sort of flat out conspiracy theories.
Right.
That would require the involvement of so many people that it's just implausible that the conspiracy could be maintained. So, it becomes unrealistic. It kind of develops into sort of Hollywood fantasy at a point. And there's also a lot of, and I think I may have mentioned this last time I was on the show, there are people who say, well, the CDC owns some patents because the CDC does research. They own some patents in the vaccine field, and there's some presumption that therefore the CDC or some people in the CDC are making money off of vaccination. And that just fundamentally misunderstands how the federal government works. Agencies don't get to keep the revenues that they bring in. They all go back to Congress, and Congress decides how to reapportion them and does whatever it wants with them. So there's really no incentive for any government level holder of a patent to be promoting vaccination based on the existence of that patent, because it's not going to profit them any. It doesn't exist. There's no mechanism by which that would work.
Right. Okay. I'm going to take a few more questions and then we'll wrap this up because we're at an hour and a half. And Dinah Cat Loves Me says, why are the frequency of booster immunizations increasing? I don't know that that's so much a thing.
Well, there have been, I think, a few where they've said that, and really all of this is based on scientific study, and we examine over years and decades the effect of vaccination on people and the degree to which the antigens that are developed through an initial vaccination remain in the blood and continue to be produced. So as science refines its understanding of how long lasting a vaccination is, there are instances where they say, okay, you need a second booster at some point, or you need more frequent boosters for things like Tdap, and really whenever there's, like when we had this measles outbreak last year, the government issued an advisory that, even if you had a measles vaccination, you should get a booster just in case, just to protect yourself, to ensure that, in case your immunity is worn off, that you're still immune. And that's not necessarily speaking to whether the vaccine was effective or remains effective. It's just, here's an extra precaution that you can take.
Right.
So, I don't think that it speaks to the functionality of the vaccine so much as to the fact that we are constantly refining our scientific knowledge.
Right. Well, that's fair enough. Well, thanks for being on the show. I have a link to your Twitter in the description, as well as the title of your book. If you guys are interested in vaccine law, that's a good resource. You can check it out. And I'm trying to think who's on next month. Next month, I have a few people. I have Fossil Locator, who's going to talk about fossils. I have and all the different misconceptions associated with that and the misrepresentation of fossils. We're going to talk about that. I've got Dr. Leah Torres on with Nate Brody to talk about Roe versus Wade, about abortion and that sort of thing. So that'll be really interesting. And I'm lining up an astrobiologist. So we're going to talk a bit about life on other planets. Maybe that's a thing that might be kind of cool. So thank you again, Brian Dean Abramson, for being on the show. All of his information is in the description, and check it out.
Hey, it's absolutely been a pleasure to be on, and we will do this again in the future.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Well, if you've stuck around, I'll hand out some Mel's Minions points. I'll have some challenges starting out next week for you to play along at home, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
you.